I've received emails from probably close to 100 people who have heard this story and said, like, I love the church, but my entire heart is shaken over this. If this is true, if our church really did know this abuse was happening, that's devastating to my faith and to my trust in the church. And I completely get that. However, I want to make some points on these 6 areas to say, this is a terrible case, but the way the church handled it is not exactly as the media has portrayed it. And mostly, for the evidence of that, we use some historical research as well as the court records themselves. So that's where all of this is going. So what is the actual rate of abuse in our church? All right, we're back with more responses to the popular podcast Heaven's Helpline out of New Zealand. I am Jennifer Roach Lees, and today we're going to address kind of the heart of that podcast, the biggest claims that they're making about how sexual abuse is handled in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. The series is 6 episodes. The first 3 episodes barely touch on abuse at all. Next, we start to get some issues, how women are treated, and then finally we're into the heart of childhood sexual abuse and how our church handles it. And the podcast makes a number of claims, and I'm going to talk about them in 6 different categories. And they're not exactly in order how the podcast does them, just for cohesion, but our next 6 sections will be responding to each of those. So the first one is they make the claim that our church is somehow this haven of protection for abusers, that if you wanted to be an abuser, this is a great church to join because you will be protected over the lives of children. And it's a terrible and shocking accusation. The story that is used here to make this point is a terrible story that you have probably heard. It's out of Bisbee, Arizona. And a man who was a church member, he ends up abusing 2 of his daughters, as well as exposing his sons to quite a bit of sexually explicit material. It's a terrible case. It's absolutely sickening. What the man did to these 2 girls is one of the worst things I've ever read in my life. And I've read just about every single document, including thousands of pages of court documents on this case. And it's bad beyond belief. Most of this stuff is available publicly online. You could go and look it up if you wanted to, but I don't recommend that you do. They use this case to say, gosh, the bishops over this family, there were 2 bishops during the time that we're going to talk about. The bishops that were over the ward that this family was in knew that these girls were at home being abused, and they sat on their hands and did nothing. That's the claim. The bigger implication there, they use this story to say, and that is normal practice in this church. And it's a shocking claim. I've received emails from probably close to 100 people who have heard this story and said, like, I love the church, but my entire heart is shaken over this. If this is true, if our church really did know this abuse was happening, that's devastating to my faith and to my trust in the church. And I completely get that. However, I want to make some points on these 6 areas to say, this is a terrible case, but the way the church handled it is not exactly as the media has portrayed it. And mostly, for the evidence of that, we use some historical research as well as the court records themselves. So that's where all of this is going. So what is the actual rate of abuse in our church? If you were reading stuff in the press, if you were listening to media on this, they would have you believe it's extraordinarily high. The question of what is the rate of abuse is a really, really tricky question to ask. And if you're familiar with this topic at all, you've probably heard statistics like 1 in 3 girls or 1 in 6 boys or something like that. And that's a good kind of average across the board. Here's the national statistics on how often abuse happens. But when you want to get more specific into how much does abuse happen in one group compared to another group, it is just notoriously tricky to answer. Abuse is a crime that happens in secret. Predators are pretty good about keeping it secret. Victims often feel shame and don't want to talk about it. So it's information that's just really, really hard to get to. The kind of further making it difficult is there isn't really a way to do kind of an apples to apples comparison. We can look at like abuse that's known in a variety of churches and then ask the question, is there a reason why it's more known in one church and not in another? If you asked maybe just the average person on the street if they knew about sexual abuse in any churches, they might bring up the Catholic Church example, but it's been in the media a lot. So if people know anything, they might say, oh yeah, it's very, very bad there, overlooking perhaps this church down the street from them where it could be worse. People have heard about those cases more, so it brings it more to mind. So it's really hard to make some comparisons. And without like really great data on how to do this, we get some terrible claims against our church because in recent years, these stories have been in the media a lot. So I've gone over this material before in other settings, but I want to just do a full explanation of this data that I did research on a couple of years ago that kind of helps us answer that question. Is our church really a haven for abusers? So you are very familiar, I'm sure, with the fact that Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints was formerly had a very close relationship with the Boy Scouts of America, and that the Boy Scout program was part of the church for a really long time, for decades. It predates even when I joined the church, so it's been gone for quite a while. But that was a big part of church culture over the years. The Boy Scouts have been in the news really even in the last 8, maybe going back 10 years now, because of the abuse that happened all across the country, actually all across the world, abuse happening in various troops at Boy Scout camps, different organizations. Because our church had such a high percentage of Boy Scout troops, it actually becomes a really, really interesting data set to look at. So Boy Scouts, thankfully, have been pretty good record keepers. Going back about 85 years, we have files on all the cases of abuse that have been sort of found out among them. The historic files on that, not the most recent ones, people who are receiving money out of the Victims Compensation Trust, but the cases prior to that, Boy Scouts kept records in what they called the perversion files. Most people call them the P files for short. The P files are a list of every single abuser that the Boy Scouts knew about. These files are actually online. You could go read through them if you want to. The Los Angeles Times owns the database that contains all of the information in every single one of those files. And a number of them, even the ones going back more than 80 years, are rather complete. So we have this great source of data. One of the pieces of information that they collect in those files on every single abuser is, what is the man's religion? Which is really interesting. So we have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these P files and the ability to know what church the man was coming from. In order to make any of that information make any more sense, we have to know how many troops did our church actually sponsor in the Boy Scouts. And it varies by decade. But if you average it over the decades of the last 80 years, it's about 30% of the Boy Scout troops were sponsored by our church. The bulk of the rest of them are sponsored by other churches. Some of them are sponsored by civic groups, sometimes the police association, or sometimes a community group will sponsor one. But the vast majority of the Boy Scout troops over time have been sponsored by various churches. There have been a number of attempts to say how much of that abuse belongs to our church, is the fault of our church. So here's where it gets interesting. 30% of the troops, we're averaging that out over decades, 30% of the troops belonged to Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saint churches. Did 30% of the abuse happen in those troops? We know the religion of not every single one, but the vast majority of the abusers. And so we can start to ask some really interesting questions. So of the entire set of P files, I went through to analyze the information. Some of them had to be taken out of the sample simply because they didn't have enough information. It's actually pretty rare. Most of them have the man's religion, his location, the year that things happened. And there are some files in there that had remarkably little information to go on, and they just weren't useful. So those files got removed from the sample. We also took out the files where no church affiliation was listed and none could be determined by the other information in the file. So sometimes a man's religion would not be listed, but the troop you can see is sponsored by the local Methodist church. It's reasonable to understand that this man probably has at least some affiliation with that church in order to be serving in the Methodist version of a troop. So if no church was found in the file and it couldn't be discerned, those also got removed from our sample. It ends up being, those two categories together ended up being about 4% of the total files. We removed another 1% of the files because they were non-abuse perversions. For example, men used to be removed as leaders from the Boy Scouts who were homosexual, and they ended up in the P files. So you have a lot of these in the 40s, 50s, 60s, even into the 70s, men are being removed for being homosexual, and they're sort of banned from being leaders on that alone. Those are cases that have nothing to do with abuse. They weren't abusing boys in the troop. They were grown men who had grown men partners. They still, because of the culture at the time, they still end up in those files. It has nothing to do with children, so those were removed as well. It doesn't make sense to include them. But it leaves us with about 95% of these just hundreds and hundreds of files to work with. So we can ask the question, 30% of the troops were LDS-sponsored troops. Were 30% of the abuse cases happening in those troops? If we expect 30%, you would be extremely disappointed because the actual number, the number of abuse cases that are related to Latter-day Saint troops, it's 5%. With 30% of the troops, 5%, it's actually 5.16% of the abuse, which is really interesting. It's not a perfect way to determine how much abuse is happening in our church. However, that's a pretty interesting number. 30% of the troops, you would expect, if abuse was distributed evenly, that 30% of the abuse would be in it, and it's not. It's 5. One of the claims that's made in this podcast and elsewhere is, the number seems so low because the church forces people to hide it, or the church has taught people don't bring shame upon the church, so you must hide these things and not speak about them. And it's an interesting claim. And even I, who haven't been in the church all that long, I can kind of look back in the past and see like, okay, I can see how someone might make that claim. I don't really believe it, but I can kind of see how they get there. But here's what's interesting, at least to me, that presupposes that other churches wouldn't be embarrassed by abuse at exactly the same rate. If Latter-day Saints would hide the abuse that happened because they didn't want to bring scandal on their church, don't you think that Methodists and Lutherans and Baptists who love their churches just the same as we do, that they would be doing the same thing? The idea that somehow our church had this special relationship with wanting to hide abuse, there's no evidence to suggest that could even be true. So the number of 5% of abuse is pretty interesting. When you look at, okay, why? How are we getting such a low number? Could that just be a fluke? Could that just be something weird? I had a professional statistician friend help me with the numbers. He tells me there's 1/10,000,000th, which is like 0 point, I think, followed by 16 zeros. 1/10,000,000th of a chance that this is just happening by fluke, meaning something is driving this. Why are we getting that much lower of a number than you might expect? And it can't be explained away by people just wanting to protect the church. Another way to say that, why are we getting this 5% number, is to say you find a quarter of the abuse that you would statistically expect in that sample. You find 1/4 of it, which which is pretty interesting, 75% less than you would expect to find. So the claim that there is more sexual abuse in our church than in other churches, it just doesn't pan out. I would love to know where they're getting any information that is able to make that claim. They used this case in Bisbee, Arizona to make that claim. And it's one case, and it's one terrible case. But it does not support the claim that they're making. It's shocking. It's extremely emotional. It's devastating to hear about. But one really, really, really bad case does not prove there's more abuse in our church than others. The reality is that from the best research that we can find, the best data set that might even begin to answer this question, it's not true. I would love to be able to replicate that research somewhere. If there was another data set of even remotely similar information, I would love to have a look at it. I've been asking that for 2 years and haven't been able to find any other set. These files are available online. I also would love if someone else wanted to analyze the information, like see if you can replicate our results, because I think they're pretty replicatable. So the rates of abuse are higher. They make that claim. It just absolutely is not true.